Okay, so as introduced, so the topic of this last panel here on stage 2 is digital diplomacy. How does the digital world, ICT, actually impact on foreign policy? So we decided not to wear suits here, and we are no diplomats at all, but all of us actually have been related, or we are related actually, to the boring world of politics, of foreign politics, but we would like to take the chance actually to discuss with you at some point here and a bit actually so to introduce the issue, which is somehow came up the first time to me actually in the course of the Green Movement 2009 uprising in Iran. So at that time I used to work for another think tank here in Berlin called the Aspen Institute. We did a conference program on civil society dialogue. So, and one of the countries we focused on was Iran, and I was in heavy contact with bloggers, internet activists in Iran from 2007 to 2009, and we made it happen to invite some of these folks over to Germany to have discussions behind closed door about so what's going on in this colorful, mysterious Iranian civil society where everybody was talking about, but nearly nobody actually had really a clue who are these guys. So one of the guys actually we invited was Ehsan. Ehsan Arusi is an internet activist from Iran. He lives since 2009 in Germany because things change in Iran and times get harder for internet activists. I think he will tell a bit about that. We have next right to me actually Marietje Schaake, who is a member of the European Parliament from the Dutch Liberal Party, and she was called or awarded last year by the Wall Street Journal as the most wired politician in Europe. So I think that's a very interesting title these days, and unfortunately she's very unique with that because it's not really a big thing still in the parliament world actually, despite a couple of parliamentarians who explore what you can do with Twitter, and they usually crash at some point. There are more than one scandal on this. But so if you talk about the concept of what can classical foreign policy do with the internet, with social media, with ICT in general actually, so then one has to give credits to our friends on the other side of the Atlantic. The United States State Department was the first foreign ministry who came up with a comprehensive approach on digital diplomacy. It's called the 21st Century Statecraft, and we are happy to have Dan with us, who is not here as an official State Department employee, but he has a lot of internal Washington belt inside knowledge to give us some insights actually, so what these guys are about and what experiences he made so far in that world. Okay, so that's the introduction. Let us start. Where's my little piece of paper? So I wanted to start with Mariette, who is on a daily basis in contact with all these foreign policy guys, with politicians in general, with people from the ministries in various countries. And I would like to ask you, so what is the special thing, what makes digital media, what makes ICT so important for foreign policy, which is normally, as I said, not really considered as somehow linked to this medium?
Well, personally, I think it's very important because new technologies impact our daily lives, the lives of people across the world in almost every aspect. It has allowed people to break through monopolies. Technologies can help enhance human rights such as access to information, freedom of expression, press freedom, freedom of assembly, the documentation of human rights violations and sharing them across the world. So there's a lot of issues that are in the human rights field or in other foreign policy fields where technologies become a more important subject or element of this. But if you look at this field of foreign policy experts traditionally, I don't think people in Europe on the whole consider it to be such an important topic yet. So one of my ambitions is to ensure that people have sufficient understanding of how technologies work, both in enhancing people's opportunities, freedoms, rights, but also in the threats that people face. Because the other side of this is, of course, that all across the world we see mass censorship, surveillance, targeted attacks, tracking and tracing of activists, the use of GPS signals coming out of our phones to disperse 10 people on a street corner. We all know the examples. We hear of people who are tortured for their passwords. We hear of activists who've been presented with transcripts of all of their email and mobile communications in prison. So the torture for the password wasn't even necessary anymore, because with viruses and other technologies, entire private conversations have been stolen anyway. So it's a constantly moving field, and for all the great stuff that democracy entails, our policy making is slower than technological developments go. So we have to be smart and see how we can have adequate policies that guarantee people's human rights, but also allow for business opportunities to flourish in the context of technologies developments. And I think we're running behind the ball now, and it would be my goal to get ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Dan, I already mentioned that the US State Department is maybe a bit more ahead of the Europeans in the regard how you can respond as an official ministry and a government actually to these digital developments. So maybe can you walk us through this statecraft approach? So what is the State Department doing? So so some concrete examples actually, so so that we can have a better understanding of what digital diplomacy can mean in practice.
Yeah, and again, I can't speak on behalf of the State Department. I work for a government agency that is an independent 501c3, so that's doing internet freedom projects. And the United States as a whole, from both a half inside and outsider, is definitely not doing it perfect. And then there's a lot of space to do better. And as an example of a program that I'll kind of toot my own horn, the program I work for called Freedom to Connect is sort of a response to what the State Department and other government agencies funding internet freedom weren't able to do right, and that is to respond very quickly to events as they happen day to day. So what they've done is, after initially saying at the congressional level of all of these funds for internet freedom are going to be available to the State Department, which has a diplomatic agenda and has all these other reasons for making decisions that are maybe not within the best interest of everybody within a country. How can we break that money up and make it more agile and nimble so that it can be spent for people that are, don't have the ability to, say, apply for $500,000 for an internet freedom project to the Department of State, or that aren't an educational institution or a known not-for-profit that is comfortable to fund. And that's essentially what my role is in DC right now, is to go out and find these projects kind of through a different methodology.
Okay, thank you. So Ihsan, as I mentioned actually, so you have been an active member of the digital world in the Iranian civil society, so you're still in your capacity as a journalist at the Deutsche Welle linked to what's going on in the ICT world in Iran. So why do you think that democratic governments should be active in non-democratic arenas actually, and support people like bloggers, internet activists actually, who try to fight for internet freedom?
Well, as internet revolutionized, as you said, our lives in many aspects, it has also empowers people in closed societies. It increases the possibilities for participation, it improves education, and I think there is a common goal here in the countries under repressive regimes. The people are seeking for change, and the foreign governments are also wanting change in these kind of countries like Iran. And in the countries under repressive regimes, people are really in need of help because they're facing massive surveillance and censorship. And that's what the foreign governments can do, that they can help the digital communities because they are the sources of change at the end of the day in these kind of countries. And in these educated young societies anyway, like Iran, the change is inevitable. But these days, the problem is getting more and more complicated because the countries who have the internet freedom on their agenda are also, or are promoting internet freedom abroad, are also trying or increasingly planning for censorship and surveillance at home. So what really matters here, the important point is that internet is simultaneously helping both sides, the good and the evil. And that makes it the situation and challenges really more complicated here. I think we will talk about it later, about the challenges that it is making in this field.
But maybe one thing you could add is, so if you could give us a picture, so what is the Iranian government doing in the digital world actually to the civil society?
First of all, I have to say that Iran is having a multi-layered, sophisticated censorship system. But the important point is that this system would have never existed without the foreign aid, without the foreign help. I mean, they wouldn't be able to do that. One very important point here is to control this current of exporting, whatever you want to call it. It's like cyber warfare or digital arms or whatever. But this is something that is really, I mean, obstacles against change in any closed society, and also endangering lives of people. I mean, it shouldn't be necessarily about torturing or detaining, but even my brother, for example, just because of having a Skype call with his anti-revolutionary brother living in exile, may be interrogated or detained for some hours even. And that is what is happening on the ground. I mean, the Iranian regime is having one of the greatest firewalls, and it's all made by the foreign corporates. And whenever you go after them, or the information is leaked about this kind of secret deals, mostly secret deals, they come, and even in European Parliament, we have been there in a meeting about internet and mobile phones impact in Iran. They all come, they send their soldiers, articulated people, professional justifiers to say that yes, we apologize, but we suspend all our cooperations with Iran or any other country like Syria. But the problem is that these facilities, these equipments are still there, operating and spinning like the centrifuges of Iranians' dangerous nuclear facilities, but nobody actually cares about that.
That's interesting. Dan, you have some experience working for Al Jazeera in Cairo and in Egypt actually during this Arab Spring times actually. So one of your challenges was actually to secure safe communication of Al Jazeera journalists with the headquarters. So maybe you can tell us a bit actually how the system in Egypt worked.
Yeah, to what you're saying, a lot of these stories come out unfortunately after. And as we're seeing now, a lot of stories are making it outside of just the trade press and random anonymous pirate pads and ether pads of journalists that are lost their sources and now know why. And that's because of a lot of the surveillance networks that existed in these countries and a lack of information for journalists working in the field telling their sources that it's okay to text me, it's okay to call me, it's okay to use Skype. When the truth is, of course, all that did was lead to their detention and torture in many cases. And so Al Jazeera, one of their, I think, very forward-thinking, they realized this pretty early on and didn't do what I think a lot of mainstream media should have done and has done and since, which is talk about it and say like, oh, hey, but they did bring on people that were privacy and security centric, that had a background in both technology and journalism to really define the use case of what it is that a journalist in the field needs to secure their communication with the source, And equally as important, what do they need to secure and ensure that their conversation with their editor is private? Because if you have a secure conversation with a source, but then you send an email to your editor about every single one of your sources in an unsecure way, you just gave up 15 or 20 names in a way that you didn't know that they were looking at. So part of my goal is to engage with folks and not just say, oh, okay, this is really cool, sexy technology that's going to encrypt, 4096-bit, blah, 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 that nobody in the field cares about, but is actually to hear, what advantage does that do, if any, to you? If everybody's just using a regular, for lack of a better phrase, dumb phone instead of a smartphone, then no Android app in the world is going to make that communication safer and actually solve your problem.
Well, and it also doesn't exist in a vacuum. I mean, I just came here from Cairo, where as we speak, again, people are demonstrating against the military government. This is not all about technology. It's about people risking their lives. It's about people in the streets. It's about movements of people. And in Egypt, for example, encryption is illegal. So let's say well-willing NGOs or programmers are making these tools and then trying to get them to people on the ground. The mere possession of these apps or tools is one, illegal, and two, could also identify your intentions. So this is a very layered challenge that we need to address, which involves issues of trade, which involves accountability and transparency of our own businesses and our own policies, because you mentioned Iran, and there's hardly any disagreement about what's going on in Iran. I mean, the whole world is pretty much united about the fact that human rights are repressed there. But neighboring country Bahrain is a strategic ally of the United States, and there's a lot of challenges there when it comes to censorship and surveillance and human rights violations. And do we actually lead or have human rights lead our actions, or is it strategic objectives that lead? And this is a tension that we see getting bigger and bigger. And we also see that there's departments of our governments who are vocal for human rights, for example, but then there's other departments who have other interests to preserve, and these are often not aligned and even clashing within countries like the United States or European member states or what have you. So I think we're only scratching the surface of how these policies can actually be sophisticated based on sufficient knowledge of how things work on the ground, and not just good intentions of governments pushing technology firms to deploy tools and get them to people without knowing how they might impact people on the ground. And so I think it's very important that we keep looking at the real impact for people in the context of these societies which are changing on a daily basis, and that we don't try to address this from simply a technological angle only, and that we keep in mind over and over again that this is a complex but peoples-based issue that we're looking at, and that we're in this for the people and not for the tech.
And this kind of double standards are really important, a critical issue, and I think it's really harmful for the internet freedom at the end, because for example, the US is condemning internet censorship in Iran, and it's actually helping a lot the users on the ground to find ways to circumvent and to bypass the filtering and online censorship. But when it comes to Bahrain, for example, they don't even talk about it. Or Saudi Arabia, which is one of the most serious enemies of the internet, and is doing also a mass surveillance and censorship. They don't talk about it, which somehow means that be our friend, be our strategic ally, and you can be also an enemy of internet. And when you're not our friend, you cannot. So that in the long run, I think tarnishes this face of democracy, and also questions the credibility of this approach. I mean, when we are talking about internet freedom, it's very important even for the future of the world. It doesn't matter whether we are talking about the free world, the developed world, or the developing countries or countries like Iran under repressive regimes. I mean, it really matters for the future of the world, and we should avoid this kind of double standards, which are absolutely harmful.
Well, and also this widely popular notion of speaking about open versus closed societies. I think we have to get beyond that, because clearly the tools that are available in closed societies like Iran come from open societies like our own. So I think it's time for sort of the next level of analysis of this challenge, and really trying to be, as a community of people who care about human rights, to really start changing the field in which we work from agenda setting to action. Because I've been in loads of panels and events where first we were all from different angles trying to push this onto the agenda, but it's now really time for the next step. We have to break through some of these words which have been used over and over, which don't really relate to the situation on the ground anymore.
Yeah, maybe to be a little geeky about it too, but you hear the State Department folks oftentimes talking about, not oftentimes, more recently mentioning things like dark nets as being the future for kind of getting around these closed societies' circumvention, you know, or their surveillance networks. But that's a problem, right? Because if you have a dark net that's only accessible to a few really geeky folks, then you're creating a closed communication space that's not accessible to everybody. So while you may get around those surveillance, you're just kind of pushing an existing problem further into the internet, I suppose, as opposed to really addressing what you're mentioning, which is how do we maintain variant, you know, more openness.
But talking about credibility and double standards, so it's of course an issue which is primarily addressed to the US, so Secretary of State Hillary
And
Clinton
Germany.
actually, sorry?
And Germany.
I would say the EU too.
The EU.
Yeah, of course, no, but actually, so in public, actually, it's mostly, at the moment, actually addressed actually to the US, because Secretary of State Hillary Clinton came up with this internet freedom speech, the big one in Washington, and if you look back, and it's 3 years ago now, actually, it reads a little bit silly, actually, so it's very naive, very pink. So the second speech was different, actually, so because she already received some of these questions about these double standards, and it's not really an issue which is just limited to the activities of the US government in cyberspace. It's also, of course, something which is an issue for the real hardcore analog foreign policy of the US. So what are the reactions in Washington if you talk to people in the State Department or other institutions?
Well, of course, it always comes up whenever you want to talk about internet freedom and you're American about surveillance, because the truth, of course, is there's surveillance in Iran, there's surveillance in Syria, and then there's surveillance in America. And the capabilities of their surveillance network in America are far beyond, I think, the surveillance networks of anywhere else. And you're not going to hear anybody in America try to say that that's not true, but unless they don't know. It's just much more passive. And so I think the general opinion is the State Department's a really big organization, right? And I can talk about it from the outside. And so I can kind of tout a little bit of what I hear from the outside, which is there's a group of folks that are really trying to change the way that surveillance and internet freedom are, well, I guess the problem with surveillance is in my personal opinion, in America, it could probably get scaled back a little bit, and then it wouldn't have this ironic problem of where we're trying to support the ability for people outside of our country to get around the surveillance networks in theirs, while at the same time, you know, billions of dollars go towards their surveillance contractors in the United States. But to a certain degree, you have to move past it when you're talking about political conversations, and you can't talk that way when you're in front of Congress or you're trying to allocate more funds for internet freedom without necessarily reducing the funds that are going towards the folks that are you know, doing, whether you say it's controversial or not, lawful interception, which is that every single one of our countries, developed or underdeveloped, have surveillance technology built into, and some countries arguably could scale back how they use it, and some countries, well, most countries I think need to scale back how they use it as opposed to misuse it. So that's kind of like the non-answer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But when it comes to credibility, though, one of the notions we really have to challenge is this lawful interception one. Yeah. Because there are a number of countries where on a foreign policy level, on an official government level, The government of the United States or of our EU member states have already condemned the lack of the rule of law in country A, B, or C. And then we would still allow, or we don't even check, because that's the reality, we don't even have any idea of what kind of technologies are traded with these countries. And perhaps technically speaking, the tool that these technologies provide, or the kind of service or capacity that these technologies provide, would be called lawful interception technology. But what does lawful mean without the rule of law? Nothing, in my opinion, because if we're officially condemning the lack of rule of law, then people can't challenge the fact that they're being, tapped, or that they're under surveillance 24/7, and it makes no sense anymore. And I think that we have to align those kinds of goals and those kinds of concepts with how things work out in practice. And again, here you're mentioning mass surveillance capacity in our own societies, which is troubling, of course. But who's to say that these are not the same technologies that are traded to these countries? And it's funny because whenever I talk about the EU to varieties of people, they often remind me that it's such a bureaucracy, that there's rules for everything, how straight or how bent bananas can be, and cucumbers and everything. We have rules for almost everything. And we don't have any or hardly any rules for the export of technologies, especially when they can hurt people. I mean, we have rules when they may be applied in nuclear facilities or in water facilities, for example. So we're completely behind the ball here, and it's endangering people's lives, and that's why it's a bad thing.
But correct me if I'm wrong. So I thought that there's that software dual use is now actually on a list, actually on a blacklist, and since last year in the EU.
Yeah, well, last year for the first time, after we pushed very hard, there was a reference in the general dual-use technology regulation to human rights to begin with. So the concept of dual use, the idea is that technologies exist out there which can be used for neutral or good activities and for bad. And the nuclear engineering tools are the most prominent issue here. So maybe a pump, which can be used for a water filtering system or a nuclear facility, and it depends on who it goes to. So the context is important. And for the first time, human rights were mentioned in here, and dual-use technologies were also framed in that way. But it's a very, very superficial and unsophisticated set of rules yet. So we have to update this, and we're still waiting for the European Commission to come out with their update. And at the moment, we don't even have a person employed in the job that deals with dual use. That position has been vacant for a while now. So we're actually running behind. And the other aspect is that sometimes you will hear about ad hoc sanctions to countries like Syria, to countries like Iran. And when we look at the announcement and then the implementation, there's a huge gap there. So I encourage all of you to look more closely at the difference between the letters of statements, so the texts in statements, or the letter of the law, and the implementation of the law, and you'll see a shocking gap there.
And I'm sorry, real quick, just more transparency from both the governments on what any of those technologies that could be used for surveillance is definitely needed. And if you're an activist or a technology person, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on transparency that can be done by people that are non-government actors to fingerprint what surveillance equipment is going on. There's a tool called Uniprobe that's just coming out, which is a way for people to identify what censorship is happening in specific places, and ultimately this could lead towards a real track back to the company, the country that this equipment came from, so that we can hold them accountable, not just the government in a black room in a confidential file somewhere knows that deal happened. Because, I mean, that's really the answer. Otherwise, we're just making policies. You're kind of in the cybersecurity scare of like, oh, this reactive policy sounds good. It's going to make us feel like we have control, when in fact we don't know anything about what it is that we're making policy about. So both governmental folks and non-government people, more information will create better policy.
And if you look at the reactions of repressive regimes like Iran and China to this censorship and surveillance in other countries, and to the initiatives like SOPA, CISPA, PIPA, or transnational acts like ACTA. They're hugely covered in Xinhua or Iranian hardline news agencies, and they have recently even the Iranian authorities come up with this idea of calling the censorship in the US, for example, a dictatorship, and their own way of censorship, a democratic one. So obviously when we talk about censorship in Germany or in US or surveillance in Western countries, it's fundamentally different from when we are talking about Iran. Justifications are totally different, but at the end of the day, censorship is censorship and surveillance is surveillance, and the best version of a destructive idea remains a destructive idea.
Okay, maybe that's a good point actually to open up the discussion to all of you who has an interest in interviewing one or all of the panelists actually on this subject. There's one mic left. Don't be shy.
Please stand up.
And maybe you can just introduce you and say if you belong to a group, company, a government.
My name is Jens and I belong to me. I would like to open up the digital diplomacy to the cultural diplomacy field. I mean, it's very important that we talk about the export control of surveillance and censorship software, and I think I remember there was something in the federal parliament from the opposition about this, so hopefully we have to get tougher on that. But for me, always digital diplomacy is cultural diplomacy, because diplomacy is for me like the fight of the narratives a little bit, and so we had free radio. I mean, every culture is having ways to export its culture and to impress other cultures, and that's diplomacy thing. So. But now we have, I think it's a DARPA project that American soldiers can have sock puppets. Like one soldier can control 12 social network fake person accounts, sock puppets, right? And they're only allowed to create them to speak in Farsi and Urdu, and they're not allowed to speak in English, because then an American soldier could lie to an American citizen. But they are allowed to make fake accounts on Facebook lying in Urdu or Farsi, but not in English, because then, so that's one thing. And the other thing, we have religious and political extremists to getting a platform. So the whole thing of the narrative is becoming very fluid. And I would like to, if you have some thoughts, to hear how is cultural diplomacy, which I think is a very important field of diplomacy, is counterintelligence working against the massive fluidity of narratives.
Thank you. May I hand over to Marietje, who is one of the rapporteurs actually on cultural diplomacy in the European Parliament and came up with a very important piece of legislation.
Yeah, I wrote a report, or I led the effort in the Parliament on a report on the role of culture in the EU's foreign policy. But I think you're talking more about sort of information wars. I think we can look at this in different ways. Cultural diplomacy-wise, we can also see how technologies have given individuals more of a platform or a voice, where maybe previously they were simply a bureaucrat, a diplomat in a larger hierarchy. Now they can have their own Twitter accounts, their own Facebook accounts, and I don't know too much about, alter egos or the kinds of situations you're talking about, but I think really on a people-to-people level this is very interesting, and I see the facilitation of this as well, whether it is planned or not planned. I mean, you can say that cultural diplomacy through artists, through exchanges of students, for example, or entrepreneurs, simply brings people together who may not agree with their government's statements at all, but who will challenge them. And the fact that there's space to challenge this also is a reflection of an open society. I mean, the fact that we can have such discussions, that you can find, 10 people with 10 different opinions about how the EU is doing or how the Israeli government is doing or things like this shows, just by being open, that there is a diversity of opinions and that people do not get arrested for this. And on another layer, I think this is also embedded in the technology. So the question will be whether the way technologies are programmed are actually democratic or open enough to be inclusive, right? Because on the one hand, certain platforms like Twitter facilitate a number of voices, but there's also ways in which you can manipulate them, and there's also ways in which they impact the way politicians think. There's a risk that there's more of a dictatorship of the majority, for example. Like if I want to get re-elected as a politician, I have much more of a sense where majorities lie and where minorities are. So if I want to have the winning argument, it's much easier for me to calculate where that might be. But the strength of a democracy is also found in the way in which it deals with minority voices. So I think this is bringing a whole new field into visibility. And one short comment about the notion of extremists who've also found a voice. I personally do think that the open debate about ideas is more healthy than suppressing certain ideas. We have laws that limit hate speech or incitement to violence, and they can be applied online as well. But when with or without internet, with or without new technologies, extremist ideas have always been around. And I would prefer to see them challenged with arguments than to be banned out of sight. And usually to ban ideas, we need to only look at Egypt, where I was this morning, hasn't made those ideas shrink, but rather has made them more popular and grow.
I don't know if I fully understood all the points you were trying to make, but as an optimist, generally, I think this is kind of a good problem to have, because this is only a problem you can have when you start seeing the cultural relevance of these technologies when access has gone so far and so many people are able to be part of the debate, that you start to have a concern of, I'm this newly connected group online, and this older connected group online is now, you know, because they were there first, imposing their kind of way on me. Now that's like something to come over, but that is a great problem to have, I think, because that means that enough people are getting online that we have to address that. And I think it's great, the work that you're doing. And on the geek side, you know, think about this back in the 70s, when these protocols were written, that we're still we're still waiting, like we're still completely dependent on TCP/IP, right? Which was written by a bunch of geeks funded by DARPA in the middle of kind of the American cultural like hippie revolution, and that's why they came up with this, what they thought was a completely flat, you know, decentralized protocol to run everything. But maybe that doesn't work today. And so I think, again, I'm not saying that it doesn't work for everybody out there, like it totally works. But I'm saying in general, like you can go up to in the 90s when the Clinton presidency said that, hey, telecommunication companies in America, you need to have surveillance built in, and that ultimately led to every country in the world having surveillance built into their communications equipment because the United States was the biggest manufacturer of that equipment at the time. All of these things like are heading to where we are now, which is massive amounts of access, interconnected. You have Wikipedia, you have these things that are causing people to confront these things. So that's a non-answer, but I think it's a great problem to have.
Maybe one additional point to this, to the question of who's represented in the net. I think there's a very interesting example if it comes to the Arabic world as well as the Persian world. The Berkman Center, whose representative I think are frequent guests here on the Republica, came up in 2008-09 with two very interesting studies on the Persian blogosphere and the Arab blogosphere. And the stunning fact was actually that if you look in the Iranian digital community, actually, so it's not like it might seem from looking from outside, actually, that's only this liberal, secular, freedom fighting bloggers actually who are using the internet, but actually, so you could see there's a whole group, which is even a majority of clerics, mullahs actually, like some media would say actually, who are blogging, who are discussing religious things. It doesn't mean immediately this is extremists, but actually, it's used by much more people than in this political debate we are covering here actually, it is to be considered. So would you agree, Isan?
What the Iranian government is doing, I mean, what they declare as their goal is occupying cyberspace. They obviously see it as a territory to conquer or to occupy. But unfortunately, it's the view that a lot of politicians also have in the developed world. I think it's a really big problem these days because it's putting the internet freedom at risk almost everywhere. The internet that we know as a network of networks, it is global, and it is a driving force for change and innovation all over the world because it is global. But obviously there are a lot of groups or politicians in different countries who are working or are at least thinking of balkanizing the internet. And this is the worst case. I mean, this is the worst thing that can happen for the future of the world because we will lose a lot of things if we lose the globality of the network.
Thank you. Sorry for letting you wait.
No problem. Maybe regarding the one point that Dan had, I'm Daniel of Sekoshare, by the way. I think the decentralization on the lower layers like TCP and IP is already there. It's pretty decentral. It doesn't rely on authorities or hierarchies. And I think we have to only rebuild this decentral behavior on the higher levels like HTTP and the address resolution protocols and the content delivery. And if we have the technology that really the people see in a decentralized way, and we also work on the political front, I think we could go into a much freer internet than right now. And I think this is really the problem, that somehow in almost every system that is built, some hierarchies emerge after some time. And what could we do against this with foreign policy? I mean, there are forces against these flat hierarchies because flat hierarchies are non-conservative and power has to be conservative to preserve itself. What can we do there, maybe, to further the flattening?
Again, I'm an optimist. So when it comes to technology, the answer is always yes. Which means that the hard part isn't the technology, but making sure that smart policy people and people that represent folks on the ground and maybe a technologist when needed are all talking together so that they know that the answer is yes and that it actually can be developed in the image of what you need rather than what a bunch of geeks in X, Y, or Z developed country think is a great idea for people on the ground in an oppressive society.
Yeah, but I don't know if I understood all the technical suggestions. I'm sorry, I'm only a representative. But I do think...
You can't say that anymore. It's not acceptable.
I know.
Sorry.
I need to take a hacking course.
I will teach you Python.
Yeah, okay, great. No, but I think it is a joint effort, but we have to be realistic also about how even this is. On the one hand, you see smart individuals who are pushing the boundaries of what's technically possible, and some people are using those technologies to help people. But I've also seen it at the CCC meeting last winter here in Berlin, where somebody stood up in the audience, and I thought that was actually very honest to also say. One of the hackers said, look, we were the ones who were creating all these technologies. Just because sometimes we're caught up in the technological possibilities, you know, can we hack this? Can we encrypt this? Can we do this? And we don't always have control over whose hands this technology then falls into. And there's a lot of unintended consequences sometimes of technologies. I always use the example of the patent that Apple filed for shutting off microphone and video tools in a restricted room. So for example, if there would be a concert here, this technology would enable the shutting down of our microphone and video on our cell phones to prevent tapes from a live concert to be put online, which helps Apple presumably in their bargaining position with the record industry, et cetera, et cetera. So this could be useful from one angle, but if you imagine the availability of these tools on Tahrir Square or elsewhere, in the hands of governments, exactly, or others who seek to repress and control their people, what does that mean? So we have to have a comprehensive view and also understand that there are some very small individual, like small limited funding, big brain power oftentimes, but limited funding, limited power platforms, limited accountability also, that are doing things versus governments who are throwing millions, hundreds of millions at something, sometimes transparently, sometimes intransparently. So it's not always an even field. But there should be much more contact, I agree, between programmers, human rights defenders, policymakers, businesses, etc. So anyone who feels that their voice is not heard, come find us.
Hi.
Voices we want to hear.
I'm Toby Schwartz. I'm an occasional blogger at fistfulviewers.net, and I have a question about the way that social media narratives shape the language and possibly the content of individual states' foreign policies. I'm thinking a couple of years back, when foreign policy was actually one of the main sparks for the development of social media. Blogs in the US were started for, a lot of people started blogs after 9/11, and a couple of years later, as a reaction to the US foreign policy, the social media blogosphere really took off, and the rift, the Atlantic rift, was a big topic for the first 5 years or so until George W. Bush was no longer in the office. So I was wondering if you have any idea how this social media discourse, the frankness of the language, is shaping or changing the diplomatic language that states are using, or if the pervasiveness of information is making it harder for politicians, or the extent to which it is making it harder for politicians to speak to their own audience, like, say, George W. Bush in Texas, and it is impossible for him not to be heard in France, for example, and someone in France commenting on that from the French perspective. So is that, in your opinion, changing the shape of foreign policy?
Yes.
Could you be a little bit more specific, possibly?
Yeah, very quick, because I always saw the time thing come up. And there's other folks with questions. Two-way communication is the way forward, and traditional broadcasting and sharing of information from governments is a one-way street. And so, for example, in DC during the SOPA-PIPA debates, you had congressmen and women saying, we need to get some nerds and geeks in here to talk about how technology works. And saying this on what before was just C-SPAN, one-way broadcasting where there was no two-way communication guaranteed to come and hit them in the face while they were there. But this very much changed, because then another congressperson came up and said, so if you're following Twitter right now, you notice that that person's got an image on Facebook that makes them look like an idiot. So we're not going to call them geeks or nerds and separate them. We're going to call them experts, just like we would call them experts in any other place. And we need more experts about technology involved in these conversations. And not just geeks and nerds to say that we need more technologists, but experts, people that have an experience dealing with technology as an activist, as a human rights person, and what are the implications if you create these ridiculous policies without any expert advice, when we know how it works in any other situation is you have months of debate in commissions with experts before you come up and speak publicly in a one-way system. So I think that was really awesome to watch on television, people that are policymakers referencing their Twitter feeds and then their BlackBerry emails that they're getting from their aides who are doing nothing but following social media before a policy was enacted that would have been very bad. So yes.
Okay, next question.
I'd like to, my name is Justus, hi. I'd like to sort of go a bit further with that question, but in the same direction. Do you think that the fact that it's easier now for activists to get active and help people that live in oppressive regimes, do you think that's a problem or an opportunity, or would it be better if they would first come to people that tend to be more diplomatic because they know diplomacy better?
Well, I think that if people can find each other and help each other across the world without government, that's a good thing. And it's something we can't stop and we shouldn't try to stop at all. So in general, if there can be civil society to civil society or people-to-people contact, which is helpful for people's rights and freedoms, I think that's a great thing, because it's easier for the experts or those who are seeking to help people in third countries to be away from government, and it's certainly much less sensitive for people in those third countries if this can stay as far away from government, whether in funding or association as possible. So I think it's a great thing. But of course, people have to be able to assess somehow whether this is actually helpful or whether there are sensitivities that are unconsidered. And I think we all have a responsibility here. In the beginning of this panel, we talked about compromising calls and everything. There was a moment in time where NGOs were actively recommending human rights defenders to use Skype. Well, Skype was already compromised. So, everybody has to be very responsible and bring expertise in. And I hate to say that whether it's about technology or not, that doesn't always happen. So that should happen more often across the board, because it's very easy for people to just yell something or come up with some kind of policy for a short-term gain or a quote in a newspaper instead of actually considering the impact on the ground. So we all need to bundle this knowledge and keep advancing it, because the reality is changing on a daily basis, more in technology than in any other field, I would say.
And the interesting thing here is, so in the German Foreign Ministry, in the Auswärtiges Amt actually, so the operation by Telecomics in Syria are actually, so while they were bridging the leg of connectivity on in Egypt actually, so was something where the few experts or people who tackled the issue of digital diplomacy before and actually got a lot of phone calls. And so what's going on there? Who are these guys actually? So are they good? Are they bad actually? So, and of course, this is what, if we come back to the beginning of the discussion, so what does the social media, internet, ICT world does to foreign policy? Of course, it changed the system. So as it has been mentioned, so it reduces hierarchies which are in place. And I talked to a number in the recent weeks of high diplomats in the German ministry actually who are really scared. So because they don't know what it's about. So they don't have a clue, but they realized, okay, if my third man in the embassy in Egypt is more familiar with Twitter and Facebook actually and can make an impact, so he might be all of a sudden more important than I am, although actually, sir, I am the Deputy Secretary of State. So, and this is a cultural transformation process which is going on at the moment, not only in Germany, all over Europe, and as I said, so the US is a little bit more advanced, and so despite all the bad things we said about the State Department, so they have regular meetings where techies train the diplomats actually in what is going on in this world. So, and this is something I think we have to get, it's established here in Europe as well, because things will move on, and of course a grassroots movement here will not wait for the green lights by Mr. Westerwelle actually to help this or that human rights movement. But to be honest, actually, of course, it would be a perfect world if we could bring them all together at some point. And this fabulous meeting between Karl Theodor zu Guttenberg and some guys of Telecomics here in Prenzlauer Berg actually was a beginning. So if Gutenberg liked it, I don't know actually, so at least it was fun. But I think so seriously, it was something I think we have to, from both sides, reduce the hesitance in talking to each other, because I think we have to, something we should say to each other, and we can learn from both sides.
Yeah, but just a side note though, I mean, I think a lot of, what is success? Is it success when diplomats understand how to use Twitter, or is it a success when people on the ground are actually helped by the actions of diplomats? And as far as I can see, a lot of people that really matter who are activists, whether they're actively online or offline defending human rights, who run to the bathroom when they hear the word 21st century statecraft.
Sure. And others when they heard the word Twitter revolution. We have another question.
Hello. My handle is Guzi and my background is the German hacker community. I'm a network activist engaged in anti-censorship activities. And I agree with most what you have said. We need to get rid of this double standard. There is no way why we accept censorship from Saudi Arabia or Bahrain, but not from Syria or Iran. We should not have like civilians or mandatory civilians interfaces in our own telecommunication systems that we also sell to other countries if we say this is bad and this can be misused. And you know, every technology that can be misused will be misused. So the best thing is don't put the technology in place in the first place. Another remark is that a lot of those problems you talked about here are, in my perspective, social problems. And an old hacker wisdom says, never try to solve social problems or political problems with technology because it will not work. Technology can help to get certain things done, to give people a voice or at least a possibility to be heard. But it will not solve the root problem. And what I think what we can do here in Western countries is to fight against those politicians that have this double standards, that you know, criticize China for the Chinese internet wall, but in the same week they propose a virtual Schengen border in cyberspace and things like that. You know, we cannot talk about net blockings within the European Union to block websites away or content away, and at the same time criticize it in other countries. So, and yeah, thank you. And I think that there is one big enemy here is those people that want to make the internet a commercial-only one-way medium again. You know, that is one of the biggest threats. And also parts of the Liberal Party, for example, are in favor for this and push and press for it because their friends from the content industry pay them very well to do so. And that's things that we should address here. And if we address it here, then we will also have a certain fallout on our actions here within the rest of the world, that it's not that easy to criticize censorship in country A, but you know, want to have it in our own country or propose it. Yeah, that was all my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you.
I agree 100%, but there's the double standards are there and they trickle through to the technology level. So there's also a supply of weapons, like iron weapons, that are traded to countries where we know they're used to shoot at people. I mean, there's double standards in foreign policy everywhere. And I do think the credibility of the EU and the United States is very important. And I've mentioned this whenever I had the opportunity. When it comes to IPR enforcement specifically and the role of the content industry, I've learned in working within the Liberal group in the European Parliament, for example, in a workshop series this past year, which was in-house just to bring in knowledge about how online and digital developments are changing our economic opportunities, changing the way content can reach audiences and influence the free market, for example, that knowledge is really important. When people don't understand what technology does and how it can help creators, for example, spread their work, then it's easier for them to believe the narratives of the content industry who claim to have a monopoly on what the arts and culture are in general, for example. And I argue from the angle of IPR enforcement being anti-liberal, actually, the way in which it's organized now, fragmentation and also making an obstacle in the free market. So I think bringing in knowledge to people about this really helps, first of all. And second of all, this double standard definitely has to be fought, and I think we should use the argument that our credibility is at stake if we don't have our own house in order. But it's also not in a vacuum of technology only.
But I think we need clear priorities, and as long as our priority is money and jobs instead of human rights and freedom, we will not get rid of it.
Sure. And I generally agree with everything too, except that that old hacker motto, I don't know that I fully think. I think more people that are making new technologies with social is actually a good thing. I do think that if we have people making a whole lot of really bad programs and applications because they've been misguided, I got cut off. We're talking too much apparently. Censorship is a great problem to have, again, and that's just because I'm an optimist. I'd rather see like 5 really crappy programs that are misguided for like the one really good program than none of that. But otherwise, you're absolutely right. Thank you.
Okay, we take a last question, and then I promise you one of the most astonishing quotes I ever got from an Egyptian blogger actually on the question, so what the West can do to help spreading democracy in the Middle East. But you go first.
So, I'm sorry, I'm not agree with you, and not also with him. I don't think we have double standard. We have just one standard, and that is we are supporting human rights in Europe and everywhere in the world. But we have collateral. If you speak about Bahrain, you have to understand why US act like this. And definitely it is because of Iran. Because if you look at Tunisia, for example, US supported democratic system even if Tunisia was a partner of Saudi Arabia. So that is politics. And I'm not agree with it, but in a way I understand it. Using of the double standard, as Ehsan said, at the end of the day, help the government like Iranian government. They use it, they go out, they say, look at us, Occupy New York movement. They are like us, they don't allow the people to speak. So please keep it clear, the European support human rights. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think we agree with that, and so therefore I give you the quote of an Egyptian blogger called Allah Abdar El-Fattah, who said in an interview with another friend of us, Sami Ben Khabia, who's also been here, I think, one of the prominent Tunisian bloggers, on the question, so what can the US and others do? Here he addressed this to the US, but I think it also goes for Europe. And he says, if the US companies, or we say European countries, Western companies and non-profits, want to support democracy in the Middle East, the best they can do is continue to develop a free, neutral, decentralized internet, fighting the troubling trends emerging in your own backyards, from threats to net neutrality, disregard for users' privacy, draconian copyright and DRM restrictions, to the troubling trends of censorship through Kurds in Europe, to restrictions on anonymous access and rampant surveillance in the name of combating terrorism or protecting children or fighting hate speech or whatever. You see, these trends give our own regimes great excuses for their own actions. You don't need special programs and projects to help free the internet in the Middle East. Just keep it free, accessible and affordable on your side, and we'll figure out how to use it, get around restrictions and imposed by our governments, and innovative and contribute to the network's growth. With this happy note, thank you all actually for coming. Thanks for staying with us here on the last panel, and enjoy the weekend in Berlin.